I knocked on the door, expecting a brief stay, then she smiled and said, "You'll be staying here tonight." And just like that, everything changed. I had been traveling all day, the late summer sun pressing down on the city streets, making the air feel thick and restless. By the time I reached the old apartment building, the sky was already bruising into shades of purple and gold. The building itself had an unassuming charm, brickwork softened by ivy crawling up the corners, a brass mailbox glinting faintly in the fading light. I paused at the front door, suitcase in hand, feeling a flicker of nerves I couldn't quite name. The moment the door swung open, I was met with a warm, inviting smile. She was taller than I had expected, with an easy grace that seemed to fill the narrow hallway. Her hair was a soft chestnut, streaked lightly with silver, pulled back loosely so a few strands framed her face. Her eyes, kind, perceptive, and just distant enough to feel mysterious, caught mine, holding me in a gaze that made the city and the long day behind me vanish for a heartbeat. "You'll be staying here tonight," she said, her voice calm, but with a subtle undertone of amusement, as if she already knew exactly how the evening would unfold. Her words were simple, almost casual, but the warmth behind them made the apartment feel less like a temporary stop and more like a place that could belong to someone. She stepped aside, and I followed her in. The door closed behind us with a soft click, sealing off the noisy street and leaving only the faint scent of lavender and old wood. The apartment was modest but inviting, wooden floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot, framed photographs on the walls, and light filtering in through sheer curtains that made the space feel gentle and lived in. There was a faint hum from a vintage refrigerator, the kind that seemed to remember decades of meals and quiet nights. As she showed me around, I couldn't help but notice the subtleties that revealed who she was: the careful arrangement of books on the shelves, the small ceramic figurine on the windowsill catching the evening sun, and the way her hands moved lightly over surfaces, brushing against them as if confirming their place in the room. Each gesture was graceful, unassuming, yet somehow magnetic. Our hands brushed once, briefly, when she handed me a folded key. That tiny touch sent a jolt I wasn't expecting, and I realized I was already hyper-aware of her presence, the way her scent lingered in the air, and the quiet steadiness of her smile. She had a way of moving that was calm and deliberate, yet it carried an unspoken invitation for conversation, for connection. By the time I placed my suitcase in the corner, I felt a strange sense of ease, as though I had walked into a space I had been unknowingly seeking. There was no rush, no expectation, just a gentle, warm introduction that made the thought of leaving tomorrow almost unbearable. And though I didn't say it aloud, I knew that the night ahead would be unlike any other. After she left me to settle in, I wandered slowly through the apartment, letting my eyes trace the quiet details that made the space feel alive. It wasn't just an apartment, it was a small, curated world, carefully arranged yet unmistakably warm. A soft throw lay folded over the arm of a worn leather chair, its fabric faintly perfumed with lavender, the same scent I had noticed on her. On the shelves, books stood in careful rows, some with spines cracked and softened by repeated reading. Framed photographs showed her smiling in moments I couldn't yet place, at a seaside town, laughing at a dinner party, standing beneath a cascade of autumn leaves. Each snapshot felt like a fragment of a life I was only beginning to glimpse. Curiosity pushed me toward the kitchen, where a small kettle whistled softly on the stove. I poured myself a cup of tea and carried it to the window, resting my elbows on the sill. Outside, the city hummed with life, but inside, the apartment offered a quiet refuge. That was when she returned, moving with the same calm grace that had caught my attention at the door. She carried a folded blanket, which she draped casually over the back of the chair. Her fingers brushed mine for a fraction of a second, a ghost of contact that sent warmth through my chest. "I like to keep things simple," she said, her voice light yet steady, as she settled across from me. "It makes the evening feel less rushed." Her gaze lingered just a moment too long, and I caught myself hoping it wouldn't break. There was an ease to her presence, but also a subtle tension, like a current running beneath the surface, one I felt pulled toward without fully understanding. We talked quietly, about the little things first, the weather, the oddities of city life, a favorite cafe down the street. Then, gradually, the conversation deepened. She mentioned a favorite author and the stories that had shaped her over the years. I shared anecdotes from my own life, feeling a strange sense of freedom in her attentive listening. Every so often, her fingers would brush the edge of her cup, a small, delicate movement that seemed to linger in the air longer than it should. I found myself aware of it, and of her. At one point, she leaned over to adjust a pillow near me on the chair. Our knees almost touched, and the air between us carried an unspoken electricity. The faint warmth of her hand as she repositioned the cushion lingered, and I realized how much I was absorbing every subtle gesture, her quiet confidence, the way she allowed herself to be gentle without expectation, the way her presence seemed to anchor me. Time passed without our noticing. The city outside dimmed further, and the apartment seemed to cocoon us in a soft, golden glow from the table lamp. I sipped my tea slowly, acutely aware of the scent of lavender, the soft rustle of her clothing when she shifted, and the understated intimacy of simply being near her. There was no rush, no pressure, only a growing, delicate curiosity about the woman who had, in a single smile at the door, already made the night feel significant. By the time I finally set my cup down, I understood something subtle but profound. This stay wasn't just a temporary arrangement. The connection, fragile and quiet as it was, had already begun to root itself. And I didn't want it to end. The first night settled into a quiet rhythm, the apartment now feeling less like a temporary stop and more like a place that existed in its own intimate time. I found myself drawn to her presence in ways I hadn't expected. There was a subtle gravity to her, the way she moved, spoke, even paused, that made me notice things I usually overlooked. The soft flicker of candlelight reflecting in her eyes, the faint warmth of her hands as she folded a blanket, the way her hair caught the light when she tucked a stray strand behind her ear. We ended up in the living room, sitting not far apart on the couch. I had intended to retreat into my own thoughts, but conversation had a gentle pull. She spoke of her childhood summers in a quiet coastal town, the scent of salt air and old wooden piers lingering in her memory. I listened, enthralled, picturing her laughing under the sun, feeling the weight of time in her stories, the experiences she carried, the quiet resilience. As I spoke about my own life, the conversation took on an unexpected intimacy. I found myself admitting small vulnerabilities, moments of self-doubt, of uncertainty in new places, of the loneliness that sometimes followed me even in crowds. She didn't judge, didn't offer pat answers. Instead, she listened, her eyes soft and unhurried, her hands resting casually in her lap. At one point, she shifted closer to adjust the throw over the edge of the couch, and her hand brushed mine again, just for an instant, but enough to make my chest tighten and my thoughts stumble. The apartment seemed to shrink around us, the outside world fading into a blur of streetlights and distant traffic. I noticed the subtle rhythm of her breathing, steady and calm, a stark contrast to the nervous energy that buzzed quietly under my skin. Each laugh, each thoughtful pause, drew me further into the orbit of her presence. Her expressions were small but telling, the slight lift of her eyebrows when she was curious, the soft sigh of amusement when she teased me gently about my stories, the way her eyes softened when she noticed my discomfort with a topic. There was a delicate tension between us, unspoken but palpable. Every glance lingered a fraction longer than necessary. Every brush of fingers, however accidental, left a warmth that stayed with me. I found myself imagining what it would feel like to be closer, to let my shoulder rest against hers, to feel the subtle heat of her hand in mine. And yet, a part of me held back, aware of the age difference, of the social boundaries I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. By the end of the evening, a quiet understanding had settled between us. It wasn't verbalized, but it was there, a recognition of curiosity, of fascination, of a connection that went beyond simple politeness or convenience. As she excused herself to tidy the kitchen, I stayed on the couch, aware of her lingering presence even in her absence. I realized that this was no ordinary stay, no fleeting encounter. Something subtle, fragile, and undeniably magnetic had begun, and neither of us seemed ready to name it, yet. The night wrapped around the apartment like a soft blanket, and I understood, with a curious mixture of anticipation and hesitation, that I was exactly where I needed to be. The rain began softly at first, tapping against the windows like a gentle percussion. Then it grew heavier, drumming on the roof and filling the apartment with a rhythmic cadence that made the world outside feel distant and unreachable. The power flickered once, then died entirely, leaving us in the dim glow of a single candle on the kitchen counter. Shadows danced along the walls, and the familiar apartment took on an almost magical quality, both comforting and strangely intimate. We found ourselves in the living room, sitting on the couch under the same soft throw. She had brought an extra blanket, draping it over our legs without a word, and I felt the warmth of it brushing against my own. The silence stretched for a moment, unbroken except for the rain and the faint hum of the city beyond the windows. It was one of those moments that seems to slow time, where every heartbeat and every breath becomes vivid, almost too intimate to ignore. She spoke first, her voice lower than usual, softer, more vulnerable. "I don't usually have anyone here when it rains like this," she admitted, her gaze fixed on the flickering candlelight. There was no embarrassment in her tone, only honesty, and it caught me off guard. I realized that in the span of a few hours I had gone from stranger to someone she trusted enough to share her quiet solitude. I responded quietly, admitting that the storm made me feel unexpectedly exposed too, as if the world had shrunk to just the two of us and the small, safe bubble of the apartment. We talked about things we rarely shared with anyone, fleeting regrets, moments of self-doubt, memories that carried both warmth and ache. The rhythm of her voice, steady yet tinged with emotion, wrapped around me, making me keenly aware of how much I wanted to be near her. When she shifted closer to reach for the candle, our hands brushed, and this time, either of us pulled away. The warmth of her fingers against mine lingered, sending a quiet thrill through me. She didn't speak, only let the contact exist, unspoken but deeply understood. I felt her presence more acutely than ever, the subtle scent of lavender, the soft rise and fall of her breathing, the warmth radiating from her, as she moved just slightly closer. The candlelight illuminated her face in a way that made everything about her seem softer, more approachable, yet no less magnetic. Her eyes met mine, and there was a long, suspended pause where words weren't necessary. I wanted to speak, to bridge the distance, but I also wanted to honor the delicate tension that had built between us. The moment stretched, rich with possibility, charged by mutual recognition and careful restraint. Eventually, she leaned back, resting her head lightly against the couch cushion, and I followed suit, letting my shoulder almost touch hers. It wasn't a deliberate move, just a natural shift, but it carried a comfort and closeness that neither of us had voiced. In that quiet, candlelit room, with the storm raging outside, I realized how rare and fragile this connection was, a slow, deliberate intimacy that didn't need grand gestures to exist. The night lingered like that, unhurried and golden, leaving me with the sense that nothing outside the apartment mattered. For the first time in a long while, I felt entirely seen and entirely present, aware that whatever this was, it had begun with nothing more than a smile at the door, and was now deepening with every shared glance, every lingering touch, and every unspoken word. The morning light filtered through the curtains, pale and gentle, casting a soft glow across the apartment. I woke to the quiet hum of the city outside, but inside, the apartment felt suspended in its own world. She was already awake, sitting at the small kitchen table with a steaming cup of coffee, the sunlight catching the highlights in her hair. For a moment, I just watched her, noticing the calm confidence in her posture, the way her fingers cradled the cup, the subtle rise and fall of her shoulders with each breath. I wanted to walk over, to sit closer, to let my shoulder brush hers, but hesitation rooted me to the spot. Over breakfast, conversation was easy but loaded with unspoken tension. Every glance felt heavier than usual, every brush of her hand against mine deliberate, charged with meaning we didn't voice. I found myself acutely aware of the age difference, the reality of boundaries, and yet the pull toward her was undeniable. There was a magnetic current between us, quiet and steady, and I wrestled with it, trying to measure my own desires against what I felt was socially acceptable. When she laughed at something I said, Her hand lightly grazed mine as she reached for her cup. The touch was fleeting, almost accidental, but it lingered in my chest long after her fingers had pulled away. My mind raced, trying to rationalize the fluttering of emotions I wasn't ready to name. I realized that every small gesture, every leaning glance, every subtle brush of skin, carried the weight of unspoken longing. And yet neither of us pressed for more. There was a mutual respect in the restraint, a shared understanding that the connection between us required patience. We spent the morning tidying the apartment together, moving through the space in a rhythm that felt intimate yet natural. At one point, I handed her a folded towel, and our fingers met briefly, almost tentatively, before she smiled, a soft, knowing smile that made my chest tighten. I wanted to reach out and let my hand linger, to feel the warmth of hers against mine, but I held back, aware that part of the tension lay in restraint. Throughout the day, my thoughts kept circling back to her. I noticed how the sunlight softened her features, how her voice carried a melodic calm, how she moved with the quiet certainty of someone who had lived and loved long enough to understand herself. And yet, the age difference, the societal expectations, and my own insecurities gnawed at me. Could I allow myself to feel this deeply? Could she? As the afternoon wore on, we found ourselves sitting closer on the couch while reading quietly, the blanket we shared from the previous night draped around our shoulders. Our knees brushed subtly, her hand rested lightly near mine on the fabric, and the tension between us hummed, electric but unspoken. It was a delicate balance of longing and hesitation, a dance of emotional intimacy that neither of us wanted to rush. By evening, the apartment seemed smaller, more intimate, and I realized that the conflict wasn't just external, it was inside me. I wanted her presence more than I could articulate, yet I respected her space, aware that the depth of connection required time, care, and quiet patience. The tension was no longer uncomfortable. It was part of the rhythm of us, a slow, deliberate heartbeat of anticipation that promised something rare and beautiful. That evening, the apartment was bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun, painting the walls in gold and amber. The air carried the faint scent of lavender and the lingering aroma of the tea we had shared earlier. Outside, the city's noise felt distant, almost irrelevant, as if the apartment existed in a bubble separate from the rest of the world. We found ourselves sitting across from each other on the couch, the blanket from previous nights draped loosely over our legs. Silence stretched comfortably between us, yet it carried a weight I could no longer ignore. She spoke first, her voice softer than usual, tinged with a vulnerability I had only glimpsed in fleeting moments before. "I don't often have someone here, someone I feel I can really be myself around," she admitted, her gaze fixed on the flickering candle on the table. Her fingers traced the rim of her cup absent-mindedly, and for a moment, I realized she was letting down walls I hadn't even known were there. I responded quietly, my voice careful yet honest. "I feel the same. I didn't expect this. Being here with you, feeling this close. It's unusual, but good." My words were tentative, but in that moment, it felt important to be entirely sincere. She looked up then, meeting my eyes, and I saw a flicker of something more than friendship there, a mixture of longing, hesitation, and unspoken desire. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was charged, like the space between us had become its own living thing. Her hand, resting lightly on the blanket near mine, shifted subtly, almost brushing against my fingers. I froze, aware of the warmth radiating from her, the quiet electricity that had been building since the moment I first crossed her threshold. "Do you ever wonder," she whispered, "what it would be like, if things were different?" Her words were gentle, careful, yet they carried the weight of truth. I wanted to respond, to bridge the small distance between us, but I hesitated, savoring the delicate tension of the moment. Slowly, tentatively, I reached out and let my fingers brush hers, not fully grasping, just a light touch. She didn't pull away. Instead, her hand shifted slightly, resting against mine in a quiet acknowledgement. That single gesture spoke volumes, confirming the connection we had both felt but hadn't dared to name. We sat like that for several minutes, hands barely touching, hearts loud in the quiet room. The emotional intimacy was undeniable, a shared recognition of desire restrained by respect, a mutual understanding of hesitation, and yet an acknowledgement that something rare had begun between us. Her eyes softened, her lips curved into a gentle, almost shy smile, and I felt a profound sense of closeness I had never experienced before. Finally, she leaned back, letting her shoulder lightly brush mine, and in that small, deliberate movement, I felt the culmination of every lingering glance, every subtle touch, every unspoken word from the nights before. There was no rush, no need to define the moment with grand gestures. The connection itself, the warmth, the quiet acknowledgement, the shared vulnerability, was enough. In that golden, candlelit room, I realized that our hearts had already crossed the threshold. The emotional peak had arrived, tender, restrained, and undeniably intimate. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that this connection could grow into something enduring, beautiful, and wholly ours. The morning after our quiet confession, the apartment was bathed in soft, honeyed light, spilling through the sheer curtains and painting everything with a gentle warmth. The storm from the previous night had cleared, leaving the city streets glistening under the early sun, the distant hum of life carrying a sense of normalcy I hadn't noticed until now. But inside, the apartment felt timeless, cocooned in the intimacy we had cultivated, like the outside world existed in a separate dimension. She was in the kitchen, preparing a simple breakfast. The smell of toasted bread and fresh coffee mingled with the faint scent of lavender that always seemed to linger around her. I moved quietly, careful not to disturb the rhythm of her movements, yet fully aware of every detail. The way her fingers wrapped around the coffee mug, the soft brush of her hair as she tucked a loose strand behind her ear, the gentle rise and fall of her shoulders as she breathed. "Good morning," I said softly, and she looked up with a small smile that reached her eyes, warm and steady. There was no awkwardness, only a sense of shared understanding that had grown organically over the past 2 days. Our connection had shifted from tentative curiosity to a quiet certainty, each of us aware of the bond that had taken root. We ate together in companionable silence, the conversation light but punctuated with glances that carried unspoken meaning. At one point, I reached out instinctively to brush a crumb from the corner of her mouth, and her eyes met mine with a gentle acknowledgement, a shared laugh lingering in the air. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried the weight of all the tension, all the longing, all the restrained desire that had been building between us. Later, as we prepared to leave for the day, she handed me my coat, our fingers meeting in a soft, deliberate touch. The warmth of her hand lingered longer than necessary, and I felt the quiet steadiness of her presence seep into my own chest. I wanted to linger, to stay wrapped in the cocoon of connection we had created, but I also felt a sense of ease, a trust that this was just the beginning of something slower, more deliberate, and entirely ours. We stepped out onto the sunlit street together, a subtle brush of shoulders and a shared smile affirming the bond between us. There was no need for grand gestures or dramatic declarations. The intimacy was in the small, steady movements, the soft touches, the long glances, and the mutual recognition of what had begun. The age difference, the social boundaries, the hesitation, it all felt secondary to the quiet certainty that we had found something rare and enduring. As I walked beside her, I realized that the apartment, the storm, and even the simple gestures between us had become a vessel for something profound, a connection that was patient, respectful, and quietly electric. Our hearts were aligned in a rhythm that didn't need words to define it. And in that moment, I understood that this was more than a temporary stay. It was a beginning, a slow, deliberate unfolding of trust, intimacy, and affection that promised warmth, laughter, and a future together. The story ended not with dramatic revelation, but with the comforting certainty of two people who had discovered each other gently, fully, and without hurry. And as we walked down the street, side by side, the world felt just a little brighter, touched by the quiet magic of a connection that had been waiting for exactly this moment.